these two massive pieces of legislation in 1 year. I think you can hear it in the halls here at COP. I have heard it from a number of my colleagues. The momentum that it has helped to generate, knowing that the United States not only came back with a new nationally determined contribution, but has showed up to this COP with some points on the board and showing how, in fact, they're going to meet it. And we know, in fact, that the Inflation Reduction Act takes us, to 40% of a reduction if we fully implement it. It gets us a good part of the way toward our NDC of 50% reduction in our emissions by 2030. So I'm very excited to have that. And both their size and scope, I think, are an opportunity, but also a challenge as to what we're going to do with them. And just as a reminder, the Inflation Investment and Jobs Act gave us a $1.2 trillion price tag toward making investments on our infrastructure, $200 billion of which was earmarked for climate, for energy, and for the environment, and includes more than 350 existing programs, as well as the creation of many new ones. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, provided an additional $370 billion for climate and clean energy, and did so through an array of tax credits, grants, loans, and technical assistance to partners. Passing this legislation, of course, though, was really a first step, and now we have to figure out how to implement it, and that's what we're going to talk to our partners about today. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right in. And I'm going to start on the far end. I'm starting with Adrian Devenney, who is the Director of Climate, Energy, and Environment Policy in the Office of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Adrian was central to the negotiations over the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly its climate provisions for the Democratic caucus. Prior to joining Senator Schumer's office, Adrian worked in Senator Jeff Merkley's office on both energy and environment policy, and was a presidential management fellow at the State Department working on climate change, energy, and natural resources. Next we have Dr. Karen Waldrop, who's the Chief Conservation Officer for Ducks Unlimited. Prior to joining Ducks Unlimited, Karen served as the Deputy Commissioner for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. So again, state level official and implementation, which will be important here. And recently, U.S. Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland appointed Karen to be both on the North American Wetlands Conservation Council and the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act Advisory Group. Next, we have Casey Kadams, who's the Executive Director of the U.S. Climate Alliance. He most recently, actually, he's new like me, so I'm about 6 months or so into my role at the Nature Conservancy, and Casey joined the U.S. Climate Alliance around the same time. He most recently served as the Deputy Associate Administrator for Intergovernmental Relations at the U.S. EPA, and previously was a policy advisor in the U.S. House of Representatives for Representative Suzanne DelBene, one of my favorite members, developing bills and amendments on a number of issues with House Ways and Means. Next we have Jennifer Lorraine, who's joining us from Duke Energy, where she's the Managing Director of Public Policy. Jennifer leads federal policy and strategy for Duke Energy to facilitate and accelerate Duke's clean energy transition to net zero carbon emissions. Prior to this, Jennifer held various positions in the U.S. Senate, the House of Representatives, and the Department of Energy, and while in the Senate, played a major role in enabling the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, which was a historic investment in protection and sustainment of U.S. public lands, a bill that is near and dear to our hearts at TNC. Now, I have an empty chair next to me that will not stay empty for long, but I'm sure many of you know that people are running back and forth to multiple engagements at COP, and that is true for our last panelist as well, which is Bill Hohenstein, the Director of Environment and Energy Policy at the Department of Agriculture, and he will be joining us shortly. Bill represents the United States in international climate change negotiations. He's had a very busy week. He's also a U.S. representative to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and has been for a number of years. At USDA, he particularly focuses on USDA's ability to evaluate renewable energy and resources and to help farmers and ranchers build more resilient operations across rural lands and rural communities. So with that, we'll dive directly into questions, and I'm going to go back down to the end again and start with you, Adrienne. And I'm going to start by quoting your boss a little bit here. When Senator Schumer was on the floor talking about what the Inflation Reduction Act will mean for people, he said that the act would save Americans money on their utility bill and make it easier for them to tap into clean energy, would expand incentives for utility companies to use cleaner power, and would restore coastlines, regenerate forests, shield communities everywhere from the dangers of drought and sweltering heat waves. How will that work? Can you tell us a bit about how the Inflation Reduction Act provides for those solutions? And then from where you sit in the legislative branch, what are you going to be looking for now that that bill has become the law and both federal agencies and state governments are going to have to implement it? What do you want to see as they implement the incentives and the programs in the IRA?
Well, first, before I answer the question, thank you to TNC for organizing this panel. It's great to talk to folks about the IRA, IIJA, other legislation we've been working on this year, this Congress. It's not often that we get to come to the COP and talk about so many successes coming out of Congress that I think are really meaningful, and we're really hearing that in the, as you mentioned, in the range of meetings that we've been having since we've arrived. But at the inception of our thinking about the IRA, and of course we worked in lockstep with the president's team and the administration, we understood that climate change is a challenge that touches every part of the economy, and the way in which each part of the economy contributes to emissions has its own unique set of challenges. And so we approached this legislative effort through that lens, through the lens of having to tackle each problem in the economy with a unique set of policy solutions that worked for consumers, worked for businesses, and the whole range of stakeholders that are touched by the climate problem and that are going to be an integral part of the solution to the climate problem. And so that's reflected in the complexity of the bill and the size of the bill. The bill has hundreds of policies and incentives, different types of programs that are intended to uniquely cater to each challenge in the climate problem that we face. And so if you take any given sector of the economy, if you look at the electricity sector or the agriculture sector, the forestry sector, each sector we have a set of policy designs to decarbonize in a way that really gets a whole range of stakeholders involved. And so this panel is largely going to be focused, I think, in the land sector. We did a lot of really incredible new and innovative work in the land sector that actually doesn't get a lot of attention. We had over $30 billion of new investments for a range of conservation practices, for farmers, for forest landowners, for coastal habitats that can both contribute to mitigation and adaptation for communities for climate change. So each of our committees that have some jurisdiction over these different areas of policy had to play a role in figuring out how to bring in each part of the economy, part of nature, that really does have an important part of the solution set.
Well, I think it is important to note how complex it was, and that the bill itself really reflects how cross-cutting climate is in terms of impacting so much of our economy. Before I let you go, I do want to touch on another bill that maybe isn't getting as much attention, but I think is important. And that is that the U.S. Senate recently provided its consent, and then President Biden signed onto the Kigali Amendment of the Montreal Protocol.
I'm so glad you're giving that a shout out.
Yes. It's very important, right? And it aims to phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbons, which of course are a very potent greenhouse gas. Could you talk a little bit for our audience about the fact that this had really strong bipartisan support and how you garnered that, and why it's important?
Yeah, I mean, look, in general, the Senate is still a very bipartisan body. We were a 50-50 split Senate in this Congress, and so the vast majority of work we did was bipartisan work, and that is a prime example where industry did really, U.S. industry, U.S. manufacturers really did play an important role in bringing together a business coalition that could show that the U.S. is very well positioned to lead in the reduction of HFCs. And those manufacturers have a presence all across the United States, in red states and blue states. And that type of a coalition is so important to getting bipartisan legislation passed. And that was the key for this bill. We had a really strong outside coalition that could come to their members in Congress and legitimately say, this is actually good policy, and it's going to be good for our businesses in your state. So that's going to mean more jobs in your state if you can pass this legislation to phase out HFCs. So we had a lot of Republican support for it. You know, members that aren't necessarily considered viewing climate as their top tier priority issue, but they identified this issue as a real benefit to folks in their state that they care about.
Thank you. Karen, I'm going to turn to you next. Ducks Unlimited, of course, is known for being a strong proponent and extremely effective in protecting habitats for waterfowl in particular. And of course, those habitats are currently being affected by climate change. So I wanted to ask two things of you. One is, how is Ducks Unlimited adapting its own efforts to address significant climate-related impacts? And then how are you hoping that the United States and the international community commit here at COP27 to efforts that would help create better conditions and more enabling tools for your work on protecting waterfowl?
No, that's great. So for those of us that might not be familiar with Ducks Unlimited, we are a conservation organization that focuses on wetlands and grassland habitat that benefit waterfowl and other wildlife, but also people in many ways, directly and indirectly, because those habitats are just so critical for people, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But the important part about wetlands is that half of the wetlands in the world have been lost. And wetlands provide very important functions like flood attenuation, coastal resiliency, providing clean water. The list goes on, storing water. So in periods of drought that we're facing now back home on the Mississippi River, 30-year drought, having the storage of the water capacity in the headwaters of different major rivers is extremely important. Well, that's being lost with every single wetland that we lose. So so what we do is we focus on that conservation and that restoration. So what we're doing to kind of use some of the things that Adrian was just talking about, and those funds, we're taking our projects and we're working with partners and we're using science to do this, but we're looking at our projects in different ways. In fact, we're trying to see how can we get the most storage of water out of them? How can we hold water, maybe change the design a little bit so as the water's flowing down the Mississippi River, we can hold that water in these wetlands until the floodwaters go down and then remove them that way. Or clean water. How can we work in the Lake Erie Basin and store and create these small depressions and basins along with all the ag landscapes so that we can then absorb all the phosphorus and nitrogen and runoff instead of going into the Lake Erie Basin. So we're working with our partners on public and on private land to see how we can reimagine these things. And we're using science to do that as well, which is extremely important, of course. And we're actually working with the University of Georgia. So we're also a turnkey organization, meaning we have engineers and biologists on staff. So our engineers actually will design the projects and implement the work and then work with our partners, TNC being a wonderful one. Thank you very much for having us here. We work with them quite a bit on some of these projects. And so we're actually working with the University of Georgia now on a Master of Engineering degree where we're looking at natural infrastructure. So we're trying to train, what can we do to train that next generation of engineers working in natural infrastructure? And it's actually really an impressive program. It's just begun, but we're very excited about it. And we'll also receive research benefits out of this as well. So we're going to look at quantifying and measuring these benefits and how are these projects doing as far as reducing phosphorus, or how are they doing as far as holding floodwaters, and then coastal resiliency. We do a lot of work and research in that area too, whether it's through breakwaters or building coastal marshes back using dredge material, and making earthen levees to withstand that impact that we have, right? That adaptation. So, and then from the mitigation standpoint, working a lot in the grassland restoration, as far as working some of the programs that you just spoke about, Adrienne, with NRCS and RCPPs to work with landowners of soil health, right? So how can we retain all of that carbon in the soil that's critical? And how can that help them have better crops and rotational grazing? So, and then also in the mangroves on mitigation work as well. As far as mitigation and what can we do as far as those important blue carbon sinks as well. What the second part I think was, what do we hope to get out of that? What do we hope that does from an international perspective? Is that right?
That would be fine too.
What
You could
was
say. We'll get to that. Can you tie that a little bit to the IIJA and to the IRA? Are there particular elements of
yes.
that bill that you're excited about
Absolutely.
in making some of the things you just talked about sort of hit the ground in a bigger or better way?
Yeah, absolutely. So with IIJA, what we really like is that it brings in all of these different components, right? So you've got technology, and you have resiliency, and you have natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and then environmental justice. It brings all of those components together that I think is going to be critical for being able to have an impact that we need to have in the future, right? So that's probably one of my favorite things about that is both of them are very complex, as Adrienne mentioned, and have all of these different components. And I think that's what makes it so brilliant, is that it's bringing all of those different, whether it's NGOs or companies and others together to help solve these problems. I'm actually here with the MRCTI, Mississippi River Cities Towns Initiative, as a part of their delegation. And it's so critical that we bring, another thing that I'd like to say on that is that we bring in adaptation alongside mitigation, because they are feeling the impacts of a 30-year drought right now. 2 years after, or 3 years after, they were feeling the impacts of a 20-year flood event. And so right now there are barges that are sitting along the Mississippi River, which, by the way, provides 40% of ag commodities to the world. And there's $150 million of grain sitting on a barge not too far from Mayor Simmons, who's with me today, not too far from his hometown. Can't go anywhere because it's only 7 feet of water on the Mississippi River. And so they're feeling those impacts now. So we need to work on that adaptation. But the great thing about it is that in the language in the bill is it looks at all those co-benefits of how do we work with adaptation along with mitigation as well at the same time.
That's excellent. Thank you. Casey, I'm going to turn to you next. Of course, we know that we've been talking about, federal passage of these bills, but really making them meet the ground. They need to be paired with subnational action at that state level too, and that making sure this translates to the states is a big part of how we're going to reach our climate goals. Could you tell us a little bit about how the U.S. Climate Alliance is working to make sure the U.S. does meet its 2050 goals?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us here today and for putting subnational leadership on the global stage. What I want to start by saying is I'm going to amend the question a little bit, only because the IRA doesn't need us as an additive. The IRA and IIJA actually invests in state-level action and supercharges the work that we're already doing. So the U.S. Climate Alliance, we like to think that we are the forum, the platform, and the push for governors to deliver on climate action in the U.S. And I'll get back to those three in just a second. For those who are not familiar, the U.S. Climate Alliance is a coalition of 24 U.S. governors representing every region in the U.S. We're bipartisan, who are committed to delivering on the U.S. commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement, and using our authority at the state level to make sure that we're reducing emissions, that we're investing in overburdened and underserved communities, and increasing our resilience to the impacts of climate change. We're the forum for governors to collaborate. So, the Alliance allows governors to work together, to share best practices, to learn from one another, and to even, we like to promote some friendly competition among governors so that one governor can look at what another is doing and up their own ambition to try and go even farther, faster. And so we are really a forum for increasing ambition everywhere. We're also a platform for governors to speak with a collective voice and move collectively. We have learned that governors are stronger when we stand united. 24 governors has a heck of a lot more impact than a single governor alone. And that's part of why we're here on the global stage, right? It's why we're here at COP. To expand and share the lessons and the solutions that we're delivering at the state level to really deliver that impact across the globe and share those lessons outside of our borders in the U.S. And we're the push for governors to overcome barriers to advancing action and deliver on states' climate goals, both on a I think that was a great point on both mitigation and adaptation. And so the Alliance provides tools, resources, and supports to help states finalize strong regulations, to take advantage of opportunities for passing legislation at the state level, for them to issue executive actions, and to use their authority during the windows of opportunity that governors have while they're in office. And I think critically the work that we do ensures the durability of climate action in the U.S. We're the backstop to make sure that no matter what winds change, to make sure that no matter storms come, whether legally or politically, that the action that's happening in the U.S. is going to continue moving forward no matter what. That's where our origins come from. We were formed in 2017 as a response to the prior administration announcing their intent to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. And so we know that our actions stand the test of time. They can make sure that we're weathering the storms and that we're locking in progress everywhere that we possibly can and to make sure that we move forward no matter what.
That's excellent. Thank you. And you said a couple things that I thought were interesting about that forum and that platform. I had the opportunity, was speaking with Secretary Vilsack yesterday, the day before. It's hard to keep them straight. But one of the programs they're putting in place on climate smart agriculture has deliberately included something called this learning platform. That that as we implement this new provisions of the bill, some of it's going to work well. Some of it might have some hiccups, right? And we need to share that. Could you talk a little bit about particular actions or investments in the bill that you think are interesting, but also where there might be learning opportunities that the bill tries some new things where governors and states can learn from each other?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, in the last 5 years, I mentioned we were formed in 2017. We've spent the last 5 years advancing bold and innovative solutions, and I love the sort of follow-up because so much of what our governors are doing is learning from setbacks that other governors have faced to make sure that what takes one governor 2 or 3 legislative sessions to get across the finish line can take the next governor only one. And so it is a really amazing opportunity. And the solutions that our governors are advancing, as I mentioned, are reducing emissions across sectors, definitely investing in natural climate solutions, advancing environmental justice and equity, and increasing our resilience. And states are uniquely positioned to deploy the resources coming to us from the infrastructure law, from the IRA, and to make sure that we are delivering on the promise of that law, which I'm sure Adrian is glad to hear, right? That we're ready to step up and meet the moment and take what they've done, the work they've given for us, the good work that they've given for us, and continue to carry it forward and get it done. So some of the programs that we're tracking most closely are $27 billion to invest in deploying zero-emission technologies in disadvantaged communities through a new greenhouse gas reduction fund. We're excited about new climate pollution reduction grants, which will enable states to develop and implement climate pollution reduction plans to decarbonize across sectors. We're excited about $8.6 billion to help consumers retrofit and electrify their homes. We're excited about, and this is a great forum to talk about this, the $2.2 billion for state and private forestry conservation programs to plant trees and invest and advance natural climate solutions, $1 billion to adopt low emission and zero emission energy building codes, and $5 million to advance clean car standards. And so there's so much that's going to be flowing through our states, through our governors, that's really going to allow us to supercharge the work that we've already done over the last 5 years and continue to go further. And our hope at the Alliance is to use that opportunity to make sure that we are expanding the capacity of our governors, expanding the capacity of our states to deliver on those funds, because it's no small task. It's a very significant amount of work that we've got ahead of us for the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, depending on sort of the length of each of these programs. And certainly I think we're going to learn what works, what doesn't, and hopefully expand those lessons across the board. And that's a lot of what the Alliance is going to be stepping up to do. And if I might, part of what I think is so exciting, the program that we're very excited about is the climate pollution reduction grants. It's $5 billion that allows states to nimbly and flexibly implement climate pollution reduction plans, which is important because the challenges that Maine is facing and the opportunities that New Mexico is facing are going to look very different from what Hawaii or Wisconsin or Michigan or Washington are going to be facing. And so there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for states to see what has worked elsewhere and hopefully adopt those lessons in their own state. So certainly you can say I'm pretty fired up, and our governors are pretty fired up about the work we're going to be doing.
Oh, I think that's great, and a nice long list of things that people will feel in their daily lives, which I think is particularly important for governors to want to think about, again, how to make those things meet the ground. Thank you very much for that. Jennifer, I'm going to turn to you next. You obviously represent one of America's largest energy holding companies. And so we want to hear from your perspective on how these recent U.S. actions and investments in climate and energy transition are helping you achieve your goals of net zero carbon emissions by 2050.
Absolutely, and I echo my fellow panelists. Thank you, Darci and TNC, for putting this group together. It's such an important time. We're at COP 27 implementation COP, and these are two very monumental pieces of climate policy that the president was able to sign since the last COP. To build on Darci's good comments on a little bit of background on Duke Energy, we have, as Darci mentioned, one of the largest energy holding companies in the United States. We have 28,000 employees. We are headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. We have 1.6 million natural gas customers and 8.2 million electricity customers. And so in 2022, this year, we made several new goals and ambitions to build on our net zero goals, both for our electric company, Scope 1 net zero goal, and our natural gas business, our methane net zero goal, that I wanted to share a little bit about as well. We added Scope 2 and certain Scope 3 emissions to our net zero goal, and so that means we are accounting for 95% of our greenhouse gas emissions. We've tied those to measurable goals, and we are really proud of that at Duke Energy. We also announced this year by 2035, we will be out of coal, subject to state regulatory approvals. And in our regulated footprint, those 6 states, we will have 30,000 megawatts of renewable energy. And so to build on our progress that we've already made, we've had a really ambitious 2022. At Duke, when we look at federal policy, we support policies that align with our mission to provide clean, affordable, increasingly clean, affordable, and reliable electricity. And we believe the IIJA and the clean energy tax incentives in IRA do just that. When you look at the IIJA bill, we are talking about a monumental amount of federal funding going towards new clean energy technologies. It is 4 times the Department of Energy's annual research and development budget. And so this is such a commitment from our federal government on these new technologies that we are going to need to have in our power sector to reach net zero. So it really is a game changer with that federal government support for the demonstration or the deployment process down the line. Also, with the IRA and the clean energy tax incentives, as I mentioned, our North Star is continuing to provide reliable and affordable energy, and the clean energy tax incentives in that bill will mitigate the costs of the clean energy transition to our customers. And when we look at Duke Energy, we have a $145 billion capital plan over the next 10 years to invest in clean energy infrastructure. We want to be able to mitigate costs as much as we can to our customers, and that's exactly what we believe the tax incentives in IRA will do. Because we are a regulated utility, those credits will flow directly back to our customers. And I wanted to bring up one other point that Karen hinted at a little bit, particularly with the IIJA. What's different for our industry in a very good way, the expectations for our industry have really changed, where we value so much the stakeholder input in this clean energy transition. And the IIJA, we are going to be successful as a power sector when we partner with our communities and stakeholders. At Duke Energy, we've put in 9 comments at the Department of Energy for various new programs under the bill. And one I wanted to particularly highlight that we announced on November 1st is a Southeast Hydrogen Hub Coalition that we've partnered with Dominion Energy, Southern Company, Tennessee Valley Authority, and Battelle, one of the nation's nonprofits' largest applied science and technology organizations, to submit a comment to the Department of Energy for that hydrogen hub, that $8 billion funding. More partners will be announced, but that is a really exciting coalition that we just rolled out early this November.
Is exciting, again, the cross-cutting nature and the partnerships there that are further encouraged by these particular pieces of legislation. Bill, good timing. You snuck in just before we got to you, so happy to have you here. I'm going to ask you about some provisions both in IIJA and IRA. The first is the $5.5 billion in lands and resources entrusted to the Forest Service in the Infrastructure Act, including many of the landscapes and watersheds that are co-managed among federal, tribal, state, private, and other partners. Could you talk about that investment and how it will be implemented? And then, of course, the $2.8 billion that were invested in climate-smart agriculture and climate-smart commodities programs. Can you describe that investment and the department's goals for that as well?
Sure. Thank you, Darci, and thanks for accommodating me in my schedule. I can say definitively it is possible to get from the back of the green zone to here in 45 minutes. So I set maybe a land speed record along the way, but I really appreciate that you made time for me. And I was there talking to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, basically about the need to invest in agriculture and the need to invest in forestry and the opportunities we have. So speaking of the infrastructure law, there are resources for Forest Service to improve the resilience and to improve the stability of public and private forests. They're under threat. They're a critical sink. They offset 12 to 15% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions, but that capacity is highly vulnerable to climate change. And so the resources within the IIJ and the Inflation Reduction Act, about $5 billion in each, will go toward forest health and forest restoration. So reducing overstocked forests, improving resilience against fire, reforestation, tree planting, including tree planting in urban areas. So a lot of different things going on. The IIJA funding is already being implemented on the ground. It's happening, and we're working through the plans to invest through the infrastructure or through the Inflation Reduction Act.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, now, Karen, I'm going to ask you about the international aspects here because you tipped your hand earlier and wanted to sort of save it a little bit. So at this point, I'm going to direct some of these questions, but you should also feel free. Let's have a little more of a conversation if there's an element you want to pick up on. But I did want to ask you, Karen, a little bit about where there might be some international relevance, some inspiration from some of the work that you think will come out of these bills, and according to what Ducks Unlimited might use it for, and how we might share some of that information or experience.
Yes, so this is actually my first COP, so I've been enjoying myself thus far. And, I really wasn't sure what to expect. What types of conversations am I going to be able to have? And how is this going to further, what Ducks Unlimited can do for climate adaptation and mitigation? And it's just been an incredible experience because from the international perspective, with MRCTI, we have met with individuals, delegation from Egypt, also from India, and talking about all of the major rivers because we're all having these same issues and learning from each other. Instead of just, thinking the United States and North America, we need to be thinking, hey, how does what we're doing with saltwater intrusion on the Gulf Coast have a way to impact, and how can that be helping, Egyptian government on the Nile River and facing the same types of issues? So I think that collaboration, and honestly, if it wasn't for these two pieces of legislation and what that means for Ducks Unlimited to be able to work with partners in order to implement it, I might not be here to be able to then realize this is how we get things done. So from that perspective, I think it's an added benefit of what these two monumental pieces of legislation have done potentially to move climate change mitigation adaptation globally.
Excellent. Bill, can I put you on the spot a little bit here? I mentioned as you were running from the Green Zone, the sort of the learning hub aspect of the Climate Smart Commodities program. Could you maybe comment a little bit on how what we're learning from that might be relevant to our ag partners?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for letting me loop back around to the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodity program. It is unprecedented within USDA. We're investing over $3 billion on projects to work with partners to employ climate smart farming and forestry practices on the ground, but to create markets for climate smart commodities. And at the core of this effort is the belief that the public cares about climate change and that consumers want to purchase climate friendly options. So whether that be milk or butter or eggs or the clothes they wear. If we offer a climate smart alternative, there's going to be a preference in the marketplace for that. And we've been overwhelmed by the response. We put out a request for proposals. We received $18 billion in response. And what was really impressive is there was an additional over $8 billion of private sector investment that wanted to be part of this program. And to give you a sense of the scale of that, that's about the same amount of money we spend in total on conservation in a given year. Now, we couldn't fund all of these projects. We only ended up funding about 20% of them, so we actually left a lot of good projects on the table. But we're really excited about the progress we're going to make. We're going to wring every bit of information out of this through the Learning Network, because when we look ahead, what we envision in 2030 is a U.S. agricultural sector that's climate smart, where we think about conventional agriculture being the climate smart option. So conservation tillage and no-till and cover crops and using an enhanced efficiency fertilizer and installing an anaerobic digester and putting in all the practices that can reduce emissions or generate renewable energy. That's going to be the standard. And to get there is going to require a tremendous amount of investment and a tremendous leap in our understanding. And so the Learning Network will be an important part of these projects. We're going to be working with each partner, what their experience is, how their projects are working, how strong these markets are, and from that make decisions about what to do next.
May I say something very quickly? I would like to say thank you. Ducks Unlimited, we were fortunate enough to be awarded one of the Climate Smart Commodities grants for a rice stewardship program with USA Rice and the National Black Growers Council to implement 300,000 acres of climate smart practices in 6 states on rice ag farms. So thank you.
Well, I will say something I say to every group that received our proposal. We're counting on you to get it right.
We'll be there.
We have one shot, I think, to get this right, and so there's a lot riding on these projects.
We'll do
Well, duly noted, as TNC is a proud partner in 8 of these projects as well, and very excited to get started on implementing them. I wanted to shift gears a little bit to a different topic, and we know that one of the themes of this COP is the theme of loss and damage. And the fact that some of the world's most vulnerable are the ones who have been paying disproportionately the price for the effects of climate change already. And how do we make sure that they are able to adapt and to move forward in a stronger and more protected position? We have the same thing in the United States. We have a lot of communities, particularly Black and Brown and Indigenous communities in the United States, that are already feeling the effects of climate change, that are the most vulnerable as the planet warms to volatility in weather. And we need to think about how, as we implement these bills, they will be addressed and how they can participate in the implementation of the bill. And that, of course, was a key aspect of the bill itself, but also a key challenge as we think about how we create those partnerships to make the money meet the ground. And so I wanted to start with you, Adrian, a little bit to talk about how considerations on environmental justice were factored into the bill itself, and kind of expectations or thoughts about how we implement how the bill is implemented going forward. What will you be watching for?
Yeah, well, actually, for both the infrastructure bill and the IRA, these were really important themes that we were prioritizing. The infrastructure bill in particular had historic investments in resilience, which is going to be incredibly important to especially disadvantaged communities across the United States. And the IRA had historic investments in all kinds of environmental justice priorities. We added them up to be about $60 billion worth of investments, investing directly in communities, both in the technology solutions to climate change at the local level, but also resilience. I think you're going to see that being a continuing theme going forward in every piece of legislation that we work on related to climate. Climate is, of course, a problem that affects everyone, but it's a problem that is acutely felt by the people with the least means. And so that has to be front and center in how we design our solutions to the climate challenge. And so we certainly had that in mind for both the infrastructure bill and the IRA. In the land space, like I said, it was really the infrastructure bill where we had most of those resilience-based investments, and a lot of those types of investments were to deal with degraded habitats, but also using habitats as a means of adaptation, as a means of lessening the impact of climate change. Certainly that's true in the coast, but it's also true in the interior to deal with drought, for example. So there was a whole, again, these bills are hard to generalize because there was so many different policies and programs across the bills to deal with so many of the unique challenges of climate. But our 2 North Stars, as we were thinking about these bills, were how do we reduce emissions and how do we address environmental justice? Those were always our North Stars in designing the policy for these bills. So it's a great question, and it will be true going forward as we work on climate legislation.
Jennifer, could I ask you to comment a little bit about the same question, which is both as you make that transition to more to cleaner energy, thinking about, of course, reducing that carbon footprint and pollution, But you also have a duty to ratepayers, right? And energy poverty is something we want to be aware of, and the fact that, balancing the price of energy with other needs for those of limited means is an issue as well. How does Duke Energy think about, making that transition, but also that relationship with your customers?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And these are really important topics, top of mind for us, all the way from our CEO to all of our business units to our external affairs and people on the ground in each of our states too. I will say, at Duke Energy, we have a listen, learn, adjust motto where we may have a business operation and a goal, but if, it has been in our system to have these very early conversations with all of our communities and stakeholder input where we need to listen and adjust and work for these solutions together. And that's a little bit what I was hinting at my earlier comments on. There's just such a fundamental shift in the expectations for our industry, and that's a really good thing. Duke Energy, before COP26, released EJ principles. Last month in October, we released Just Transition Principles. As I mentioned, we are getting out of coal by 2035, subject to that state regulatory approval. We've closed 56 units. That's a good thing for cutting emissions, but those are employees and communities of ours too. And so those are really heartfelt conversations that we need to have, that some families, their families have been working in our plants for generations. And so we focus on four things with Just Transition: our communities, our customers, our employees, and economic benefits. And so these are all really intertwined in all of our business planning moving forward, these topics.
So one other thing that I wanted to chime in with in this conversation is the importance of balancing speed with delivery of benefits to the communities that are often less able to get in line for dollars right away. I think this is one of the key lessons, and I know our friends on the Hill probably had this front and center. This is a lesson learned from ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, where there was such a significant push to get dollars out the door so quickly that we know there are communities who are left behind. We know there are communities with fewer means that have less technical capability to develop applications that are competitive right away, that if we don't take the time to be thoughtful and deliberate in how the dollars are getting out the door, that we won't succeed in advancing justice and equity in the way that the bill was designed to do. And so for the 24 governors in the U.S. Climate Alliance who have committed as one of the 4 pillars of our organization to centering a just transition, equity, and environmental justice in our work as we move towards a net zero future, we're going to be really working hand in hand with the federal government to ensure that we are obviously moving with the speed that we need to meet our climate goals, because we obviously have a climate imperative and we've got clear 2025 and 2030 targets that we need to meet from an emissions reduction perspective, but we need to balance that with ensuring that we're working directly with local communities in our states to ensure that the folks who are facing the brunt of climate change, who have faced the brunt of fossil fuel pollution for generations, get the technical assistance, get the sort of direct engagement that they need in order to develop competitive applications and secure the resources that they need in order to develop and deliver on our equity goals.
That's a great point, that sort of tension between speed and inclusivity. And I want to pick up on that a little bit with you, Karen, and with Bill. So, Karen, you talked about working directly with towns and cities of different sizes, and frankly, that must have pretty different amounts of resources and capacity to partner with you in achieving those results. How do you balance some of that? Again, that speed, that inclusivity, the differing resources different partners bring to the table.
Yes, it's very easy when you to go too fast. And I mean, I was sitting here going, wow, that is such a great point, because it's easy to get excited and say, okay, we're going to change the world, we're going to fix this, we're going to do this, what can we do? And people can be left behind, very much to your point. And so very early on, just again, using the dollars that we're receiving from USDA through Climate Smart Commodities Grant, we're already meeting with the National Black Growers Council. We're going to be going to their meeting in December that's going to be held actually in Memphis, Tennessee. We're going out to those farms and we're talking with them and finding out what do they really want and what do they need. Not what do we think they need, but surveying them and finding out what are those needs that they have, whether it's for, alternate wet drying and water efficiencies, or how can they, their pumps may be so old that that's really the first thing we need to do to help with some of the water efficiency issues. So it's taking the time to talk to those partners and to talk to those people that are being impacted, and then being okay to ask other people, hey, we need some help here. How do we bring in other resources? There's, I always say conservation is a team sport, and it most certainly is. There is no way we're going to be able to make these differences alone, and partnerships is where it's at.
Excellent. Conservation definitely is a team sport. And Bill, you have just heard one example, right, of the Climate Smart Commodities program and how it's reaching out to other partners. But the structure of the program itself, I think, speaks to that at different levels, and just the sheer number of partners involved in some of these proposals and how different they are, I think, is really impressive. And could you elaborate on some of that?
Sure, and I think it's important maybe to just talk for a minute about the equity component, because it is it's central to this work. And here, USDA's legacy is not great. We've certainly have a history of shortcomings when it comes to how we've addressed equity, and it's a priority for the president, it's a priority for the secretary to correct that, and you can see that in our programs, and in particular in the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities, where we elevated equity as a priority in all of the projects, and in particular working with minority farmers, working with minority institutions, and in the grants that we've awarded, that you can actually see how that's coming through. It was also important to listen, and to listen to why things were failing, where some of the shortcomings were, the inability to navigate our programs, the uncomfortableness walking through the door into a local USDA county office. All of these things are barriers that we need to be addressing. And as we implement funding under the Inflation Reduction Act, and as we think to the next Farm Bill, it's going to continue to need to be a priority and something we address.
Excellent. I think that's we have a lot to learn, maybe from the mistakes of the past, but very interesting to see some of the structures that are really taking some of those things head on. Encouraging to see. So last but not least, I might challenge each of you a little bit with a final question as we close out here. Many of you, if you're from the United States, you might have been spending some of the late nights at the end of COP watching election returns. We're just coming off of midterm elections. We're thinking about what, perhaps a different balance in the House might mean, and how that will impact some of the work that we all want to do, right? But I think sometimes when we're caught up in today's race, today's balance, we forget to take a little bit of a step back and say, where do we think sort of politically when it comes to the issues that we face related to climate? So not just necessarily climate legislation, but how climate is affecting, as you noted, Adrienne, at the beginning, every sector of our economy. What's sort of your projection? How do you see that overall trajectory in terms of both threats and opportunities for how we move forward in really comprehensive action to protect climate and nature?
Well, first of all, I'm very guilty of spending way too much of my time staring at election returns, but most of that is now behind us, so I can return to my day job. The future is still a little murky, obviously, when it comes to legislating around climate. It does depend in part on elections. But as I mentioned before, a lot of the work we do is bipartisan and will continue to be bipartisan. And Bill mentioned the Farm Bill that's going to be coming next year. That will be a very bipartisan process. I think we set the stage for a lot of emphasis around climate. But it might not always seem explicit when discussions are being had around different pieces of legislation that it's always about climate first and foremost, even though we think about things through a climate lens. The way in which the legislative language and the legislative process plays out, that might not be the way it's talked about. That might not even be explicitly said in any part of the text. And yet, because climate touches so many parts of the economy, as I had mentioned, there's a lot of creative ways of tackling all of the related issues. I think beyond just the Farm Bill, there's a lot of bipartisan interest in R&D, innovative R&D. There's a lot of interest in all different, manufacturing of clean technology, both domestically but also exporting it to other countries. And I think that the investments in these two pieces of legislation, success begets success. As you grow a strong domestic industry and stakeholders who are invested in these solutions, we're going to see a lot more interest in those solutions having continued success.
So Adrian was reading my mind. But I really, just to echo what you said, the bipartisan interest in what we're all trying to do here, I think, is what is so fascinating. And again, success begets success. And as we see some of these programs hitting the ground, and we're able to see differences in the USDA programs and soil health for farmers, and farmers are successful, and ranchers, and the same thing all the way down the line. In these cities, we have community resilience. I think we'll see more of that across the aisle and partnership, and that's really kind of where we see it at Ducks Unlimited. Is we work with both, Republicans and Democrats, and House and senators and governors and mayors, and they all have a common goal. And I think everybody is taking a fresh look at the importance of climate adaptation and mitigation efforts. So we're really happy for what we see in the future.
It's a fantastic question that forces us to think beyond the walls that we're in right now, where we talk so much about reducing emissions, and to think about what matters to the people that we serve. Here's what we know. States in the Climate Alliance are reducing emissions faster than the rest of the country, but we also employ more clean energy workers. We have lower air pollution. We are saving more energy for homes and businesses than the rest of the country. We know that climate leadership is good for public health, it's good for creating jobs, and it's good for economic growth. And that is, I think, a signal that voters sent to us last week. Across the Climate Alliance, we saw climate-leading governors re-elected, and we also saw new climate-leading governors elected who we are looking forward to welcoming into our coalition in the new year, who are going to continue to move the path forward. And again, for us, this is personal. We founded our coalition in 2017 because the political winds changed. We always welcome a supportive federal partner. We welcome strong federal rules that are going to get held up in the federal courts. But no matter how the winds change or what storms may come, we're always going to have a coalition of states and governors who are going to continue to use our authority to drive action forward and develop more climate solutions. And that's what we're committed to doing no matter what happens next year, no matter what happens in 2025. We're going to continue to show up on the global stage to make sure that the international community understands action in the U.S. is going to continue to move forward no matter what. And that's really what we're focused on.
Excellent. Thank you. Jennifer?
And one very bright bipartisan spot on the state level with climate policy in one of our states was last year. The state of North Carolina was able to come together in a bipartisan way to reduce emissions 70% by 2030 and net zero by 2050, signed by Governor Cooper. So we remain hopeful that bipartisanship on the federal level with federal durable carbon policy is still a possibility. With that, and again, those federal carbon policies that we look at are affordable, reliable, and increasingly clean energy. And we always knew when climate discussions would be successful, which over the last year, Congress has been very successful with the IIJA and those clean energy tax incentives from IRA. We knew that discussion would turn to an infrastructure, a clean energy infrastructure build. And so as Adrian heads back to Washington and senators and congressmen and women come back, we know those very important conversations on permitting reform will be taking place. And we urge Congress to make as much meaningful change as possible while still keeping in that very important stakeholder input and environmental protections. He's going to be busy.
And what about you, Bill? What do you see in terms of some of those longer-term dynamics in terms of the support for and momentum behind action on climate?
I was wondering how you were going to frame that, because you know I'm not going to answer that original question. I will say this, though. I've served 6 administrations and 5 secretaries of agriculture, the current one twice. So I've seen a lot, and I will say that, while there's often differences in rhetoric, when it comes to sort of the principles of policy, being efficient, engaging with the private sector, building partnerships, there's a lot of common ground. When we think about, the challenges for us within agriculture and forestry, it's not so much partisan, it's more rural versus urban, and there, I think it's a matter of communication. That those populations don't necessarily understand each other. And again, coming back to this Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities program, what we're hoping to do through them is educate folks on where their food comes from, how it's grown, and then educate farmers that, hey, there's a public out there that wants to encourage improvements in sustainability and improvements in climate performance. And so hopefully, one of the side benefits of this effort will be bridging that gap, improving communication and understanding each other a little bit better.
Excellent, thank you. I think when I hear all of you speak, the thing that I find so encouraging is as you talk about the things that you're each investing in, or the sort of bill you help create, what I hear is that for people, they might just say, my farm's a bit more productive. My energy bill is a little bit lower. I have tools as a town. I have a partner to help think about managing floods or storms. And, I got a new green job, right? And most people probably don't wake up thinking, great, that's a climate solution, right? They just think about how it affects them on a day-to-day basis. And so as we see these pieces of legislation really hit the ground in really meaningful ways, I think the idea of are you for or against, right, that climate protection, it mutes that conversation and turns it into, how are we actually preparing ourselves to have good economic outcomes in what is a changing world that we need to prepare for. And so on that note, Adrian, Karen, Casey, Jennifer, and Bill, thank you very much for joining us today, for talking about each of your roles in both passing and implementing this bill. And we look forward to partnering with you going forward. Thanks so much.